All right. Okay. All right. I think everything is good to go with the stream. Okay. Bismillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. So inshallah today we hope to finish the 5th chapter of Allah Ta'ala's noble book, Surah Al-Ma'idah. Inshallah we hope to finish that. But before we do, we will take a quick look, as we've done every single time, by looking at the work from Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar, Hafidhahullah. He's done a series. He's a contemporary scholar. Sheikh Musa'id has done a series of works that deal with the introductions to the major works of tafsir. And so it'll be Sharh Muqaddimah al-Mufassir. It'll be a commentary on the introduction to, Ibn Kathir, At-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Atiyah, like all of the major works of tafsir. And so we've been reading from his book, this one in particular, on the work of the scholar that we've mainly been dealing with. There's been like 4 major works of tafsir that we've been looking at so far in our class. The primary one has been Ibn Juzay's tafsir. So At-Tasheel li-Ulum al-Tanzil. And that's what Sheikh At-Tayyar's book is dealing with, a commentary on his introduction. We also look at Imam al-Shawkani's tafsir, Fath al-Qadir. We've also been looking at Ibn Ashur's tafsir, At-Tahwir al-Tanwir. And then on occasion, we would also look at either As-Sa'di's tafsir or as a supplement, particularly for those verses that deal with ahkam or rulings. Then we would supplement with the Andalusian scholar Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki. Again, I always say not to be confused with Ibn Arabi, the Sufi, and then there's Ibn al-Arabi, who was a qadi, he was a judge from Andalus and a scholar who wrote a very famous work of tafsir called Ahkam al-Qur'an, or the judgments of the Qur'an. And so we've on occasion looked at his. But the primary tafsir that we've been referencing has been the commentary by Ibn Juzay, rahmatullahi alayh. So I'm just going to read really quick, maybe like a couple paragraphs, because every time we do this, I want us to take a look and become familiar with his approach to tafsir. So for those who are online, let me advance my slide here one. Okay. This is, okay, so that's where it's going to pick up. So I'm just going to read this really quick with a little bit of translation for you. So he says, Ibn Juzay, he wrote, قال ما أخذت من شيوخي بالمشافهة فهي غير مصطرة في كتاب. So he says that as my approach, right? So he's talking about his approach. He said, among what I have taken from my teachers, and by this he means orally, having studied with them and sat with them, it was not necessarily in written books. Meaning that there's a value to reading books. And of course, who am I to, obviously I'm well known for my addiction to books. But there is an important aspect of learning that is also sitting with teachers and engaging with them. And so what Sheikh Musa'id may Allah bless him, what he's tried to do is to help those of us that may not have the opportunities to always sit in a circle. And so he's taken a work of one of the great commentators of the Qur'an, and he's trying to give a commentary on it so that we can at least, even though it's still in a book, get a little bit closer to the idea of taking something, kind of being in conversation. So Shaykh At-Tayyar then writes in his commentary, he says, وَهَذِهِ الدُّرَرْ التي يأخذها من شيوخه كتابه يصل إليها بمحض اجتهاده. So he says that the pearls that he takes, like the little gems, as we like to say, right, in English, dropping gems. So the pearls that he takes from his teachers are like those that he reaches through his own efforts. So even though Ibn Juzay is a great scholar, he's also a student, but then what separates him from merely being a student is that he makes his own effort, by also having the capacity to do so, to take what he's learned and then put it in his own words. And so that's an important part about study as well, because it's not about, well, the Imam said this, the scholar said that, and in the beginning, of course, that's where you start. But the objective ultimately is to be able to digest that, even if you're not yourself going to become a scholar, but that you can articulate what you have learned in your own words, and that you move beyond merely regurgitation. And so he continues by saying, he says, وقيل ما عنده إنها غير مدونة في كتب أهل العلم. And so that he noted that they are not, everything that you learn is not always recorded in the books of the scholars, right? And that a lot of what you learn also comes through individual, again, having that personal relationship. I can attest to this myself, like just actually Jabril, like when we were with Dr. J, 2 days ago, right? Was it 3? How many days ago was it? I don't even know, man. I just know it wasn't today. But we sat with Dr. Jackson and we sat with Sheikh Jabril, right? And those are two individuals that I don't think there's any interaction with them, even on the casual level, that I don't personally benefit and learn, right, something from. Because just their presence and the knowledge that they have accumulated, even in just dialogue, like they give you something, right? So that's why it's a blessing to try to, as much as you can, try to be, right, in the presence of people of knowledge, because they might just say something kind of like off the cuff. And you'll go, wow, man, that's like really profound. Like when Dr. J was talking about tradition, the taqleed, and how in some contexts, tradition is about blindly following, and then others, it's like you must follow the tradition. And, so there's this misconception that tradition is a thing of the past, right? It's like it's an affair that's relegated to the past. And so mistakenly, when people talk about tradition, even including Muslims, that the idea is that we have to resurrect or reenact some aspect of the past in the present, versus tradition is an ever ongoing process in the present, and that it's like a constant relay race. A person's running with a baton and they hand it off to another person. And when you in the relay race, right, you're handing it to the part of the skill is not just being able to run fast, but then when you're going to take that baton, you have to yourself get up to speed so that when the person handing off the baton and the person receiving the baton, they're hopefully running roughly around the same pace, and so you don't lose anything in the race, right? So that's why they train, for all that handoff is very important. It's not just simply excavation. It's not just simply digging in the past and taking things that are inert, غير محرك, like they're lifeless, and then bringing them into the present as some sort of like banal, reenactment of something. Like what we would almost call today like cosplay. Like, and for some people, it is like tradition is sort of like cosplay. But tradition is a way of living, not a way of engaging in the past. Of course, there is an aspect of tradition that involves engaging of those that came before us, without a doubt, and finding great value in what they did. But the reason why, and I gave the example in the khutbah, and this is what happens, you get to a certain age, you sort of tell the same story over and over. You're like a dad, as a dad, you get like one joke, so you tell that joke over and over everywhere you go, right? But I gave this a great example the other day about one of the great scholars of the Maliki Madhab, Abu Sa'id al-Radi'i, rahimahullah. And so al-Radi'i was a student of Sahnun. Some of you may be familiar or not familiar. Imam Sahnun, may Allah have mercy on him, was one of the primary students of Imam Malik. And of course, Imam Malik himself was a primary student of the first generation of Tabi'een, who were themselves the students of the Sahaba, who were themselves the students of the Prophet ﷺ, so to speak. And so, many of this, by the time you get to the generation of Sahnun, right, Imam Malik has said what he has said. And so what happens is many of the students, like Ibn al-Qasim and Sahnun, and then their students, like al-Baradi'i and others, they leave Medina. They don't stay there, they leave. And so al-Baradi'i winds up in all places, Sicily, which we don't tend to really associate with Islam or Muslims, particularly in the same way that we associate, say, like Spain and Al-Andalus, because obviously the Muslims were there for a much, much longer period of time. Students were in Sicily for barely 100 years. I mean, the Muslims were in Sicily barely 100 years. But while Baradi'i was there, he wrote one of the great works in the madhab that anybody that knows anything about the madhab, like probably like Al-Kitab al-Mu'tamid and al-Malikiyya, Sharh Khalil or Mukhtasar Khalil. So Mukhtasar Khalil is like the book amongst the Malikis. As Sheikh Jibril said, he bought that 70-volume commentary on it. I'm like, man, see, why is the original man always got to show off? Other people, they can be content with the 2-volume joint. He's got to have the 70-volume joint. Like, come on, man, you're dunking on me, And so the great work that most of the Malikis from the middle period onward, again, Khalil's work, would not have come about without works that preceded it, right? So Mukhtasar Khalil is built upon all of those books that came before, of which Baradi'i's work at Tahdhib is one of them. And I'm not throwing all these names, you're like, man, I can't keep track. The point of it is, tradition produces now. Tradition isn't about some greatness in the past at a time that was perfect and all of the conditions were perfect. No. In fact, the conditions in Sicily, from what I saw, were not really great to be producing like incredible works of scholarship, because one, it was a constant state of strife. Not only between the Muslims and the kuffar, like the Muslims and the Christians were fighting, but the Muslims and the Muslims were fighting. And yet, by Imam Abu Sa'id al-Radi'i, may Allah have mercy on him, by him being imbued with the mindset and with the skill set of tradition, he's like, well, I sat at the feet of Sahnun. Sahnun sat at the feet of Imam Malik. Imam Malik sat at the feet of the Tabi'een, and they sat at the feet of the Sahaba or the Prophet ﷺ. So I come from a great line of tradition, and the obligation is to keep producing greatness now. Now, how long were the Muslims in Sicily? 100 years or so. And then, poof, they're gone. Imam al-Baradi'i has passed away. Most of the Muslims will not even know his name. Some of the Malikis, some of the students of the madhab will not know his name and will not be familiar with his book. But they are familiar with Khalil's work. And his work was important in continuing, right, that kind of, engine of production. So the point is, when Imam Ibn Juzay is talking about sitting with his teachers and not everything is purely in books and whatnot, and yet Ibn Juzay has written a work that here we are 1,000 years later, sitting here, studying, benefiting from, long after he has passed away. That's what tradition does. Tradition produces great results by Allah's permission and fadl that endure long after the one that produced them is gone. So the same, like Imam al-Baradi has gone into, the attic of history, so to speak, of which only nerds will probably know his name. But he produced great works that have continued to impact and benefit the Muslims 1,100 years after his passing. So I say this, that tradition is not about, sure, and in fact, this isn't about trying to revive something from the past. This is about trying to be something right now. And I don't mean like wearing this particular, jalab as an act of embodying tradition, but in a sense it kind of is. Like, this is why wherever the Muslims went, they had a distinctness about them in their food, in their clothing, in their art, in their literature, in their science. In every aspect of human production, they were distinct and different from the non-Muslim, even to the point where the non-Muslim, while rejecting their theology, was forced to admire something about them. This is why you will find in all of the museums around the world of every kafir nation, and I use the word kafir not as a four-letter word, just as people who have not accepted or even rejected the message of Islam. But their highness of a civilization, whether you're in Paris, whether you're in Berlin, whether you're in, Madrid, anywhere you go around in Europe per se, in all of their museums, which are supposed to be like, representations and demonstrations of their sophistication and their highest civilization and society, are incomplete without some type of presentation, display, installation of what? Something from Muslim civilization. And for most periods of Europe, once they finally crawled out of their caves and learned to wash more than once a year, they defined their haute couture. They defined many aspects of their high culture based upon what the Muslims were doing. So even though they might say, I reject your La ilaha illallah, I reject your Nabuwa Muhammadiyah, and on and on and on. But man, that calligraphy, that's, wow. I don't know what that says, but that's something unbelievable. Your cuisine, your this or that. And so all of this long-winded pitch is for, think of tradition as something that you do now. It's fine if it's inspired by what came before it, but understand your teachers, living or dead, if they are really teachers that are they're really worth their salt, as people used to say, then they would not be contented with merely you pantomiming what they did. But they want you to take that baton and run with it and produce something great in the own time that you live. That's what tradition and our understanding of tradition has to be today. And if we're going to reach back and take those great things from the past, then it has to be about modern day productions, inshallah. Okay, so now let's go to the 119th verse. We have 2 verses left, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال الله هذا يوم أو بقراءة النافع يوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم. On the day of judgment. This is referring to on the day of judgment. And of course, this is after the verses of where Allah Ta'ala questions Sayyidina Isa ibn Maryam and his mother, asking, did you tell the people to take you and your mother, to take yourselves as gods besides me to be worshipped? Of course, we know that Sayyidina Isa said, absolutely not. And so those that were true, and some of the ulama, including Ibn Juzay, have said that when this قال الله هذا يوم أو يوم, and we'll get into the difference, like it can be recited يوم or يوم, and we'll get into the difference between them. They're saying that this is referring to the statements of the disciples of Jesus and to even Jesus and his mother himself, saying, well, on that day, the sidq, the truthfulness of those who were truthful will finally come to benefit. What does this mean? Number one, why does Allah, because there are other verses where Allah talks about وَلَنْ يَنْفَعُهُمْ إِيمَانُهُمْ, especially when it comes to the kuffar, when it comes to the disbelievers. Allah says on the day of judgment, everybody will become a believer. This is kind of the ironic. The kafir only exists in the dunya. There are no kuffar in the akhirah in terms of people will persist in their disbelief. Everybody on the day of judgment will come to believe in Allah. But there will only be those, هُنَاكَ الَّذِينَ يَنْفَعُهُمْ إِيمَانَهُمْ وَلَا. There will only be those that on that day, their iman, their faith will benefit them or not. And the only way for your faith to benefit you is if you had faith in the dunya. The kafir will have unwavering and unquestioning faith on the day of judgment. But unfortunately, it will what? لَا يَنْفَعُهُ إِيمَانُهُ. His iman will not benefit him. But Allah is talking about the mu'minun and the anbiya. He's talking about the believers, the prophets, the messengers. يَوْمَ يَنْفَعُهُمْ الصَّادِقِينَ صِدْقُهُمْ. Their truthfulness will benefit them. Is it saying that, well, they didn't tell any lies in this life, so that'll get them into Jannah? Well, I mean, that's part of it. But what does sidq, truthfulness, in this context mean, and in relation to the context of the Day of Judgment? What kind of truthfulness? That's a question. What kind of truthfulness? Truthfulness about what? Being truthful in general? بشكل خاص or بشكل عام? Is it something specific or is it something in general? Exactly. It's about being truthful about La ilaha illallah. Why is it that we call Abu Bakr, we call him Abu Bakr what? What was he truthful about? Two things should be pretty easy. What was the first thing that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was truthful about? Even before that, he believed in La ilaha illallah, but he also believed in what? Muhammad huwa abduhu wa rasuluhu. Such that when the Prophet went on Mi'raj and the kuffar were like, you mean he went here and flew in the sky and did it? If he said that he did it, he did it. I believe in him. And so his sidq, this is why he became known as Siddiq. Right? It's on the fa'al. It becomes like a quality that he possesses. So sidq has two contexts, a specific context and a general context. In the general context, sidq is yes, don't tell lies, don't slander people, be truthful about things, be truthful in your contracts, in your transactions, in your interaction with people. But when sidq is discussed on the Day of Judgment or around the topic of the Day of Judgment, it's about Tawheed and Nabuwah. It's about La ilaha illallah and Muhammad abduhu wa rasuluhu alayhi sallam. Lahum jannat. And so as a result of that, they will be rewarded with gardens. Tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, under which rivers flow. Khalidina fiha abadan. They will exist there for eternity upon eternity. Radiyallahu anhum wa radu anhu. Right, that Allah Ta'ala Himself is pleased with them, satisfied with them, contented. And that's the thing. There's a great lesson because there's several ayat that involve this phrase, radiyallahu anhum wa radu an, like in Surah Al-Bayyinah and whatnot. When Allah Ta'ala is satisfied with you, which is an incredible statement, is He satisfied with you in this life or in the next? But can Allah truthfully be satisfied with one of us in this life? Because what if I make a mistake, commit a sin? Right? So what I'm saying is, there's a beautiful part that will drive and incentivize. To go back to another race analogy, if you see people that run a race and what keeps them going is, they want to break a record. They want to win. And so actually having a lack of satisfaction, right? Their real satisfaction doesn't come until they cross the line. Then you see they fall out and they're crying and they're so happy. Nobody's doing that kind of celebration. In fact, you'll see people, if they're celebrating a little bit too soon, but then they fumble or whatnot, you're like, see, you got a little bit, you got confused. You didn't keep your eye on the prize, your eye on the ball, you didn't stay focused, and now you've made a grave error. But if you stay focused, and you're truthful about La ilaha illallah, which of course means that I worship Him and I seek His forgiveness and on, and I attest that the Prophet ﷺ is indeed the messenger of Allah, and I do that, and I die upon that. Because he said, what? هَذَا يَوْمٌ. Will anybody go to the Day of Judgment without what? ذَوْقُ الْمَوْتِ. Will anybody go to the Day of Judgment without having to taste death? No. So, we have to rush to the finish line, not being satisfied with ourselves. Number one, because the tartib, right, the order in the ayah goes, radiyallahu anhum, yani wahum waradu an. Allah Ta'ala, more importantly, is pleased with them because He is able to take the summation of their life. They lived and died upon La ilaha illallah. They lived and died upon Islam. They worshipped Allah. They stayed up at night. They gave to every minute little detail. كُلَّ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ. Every little detail that they did. Allah will then take that. It will be weighed. It will be judged. And depending on what they did, it will even be amplified because we know that Allah Ta'ala will amplify the good deeds. And then at the end of that, Allah will make the qada. He will make the judgment. And the scale that tips to the right, then He is satisfied. So it's not about being satisfied with myself or placing that first. The only thing I will be satisfied, and I hope for satisfaction in myself, is that Allah will be satisfied with me. I will never be satisfied with myself. Not as an ego of self-perfection. No, there's no such thing. We have no concept of perfection. But I want to strive such that Allah Ta'ala, when I'm done and everything is weighed, my dua is that Allah will include me with those that He is satisfied. So, radiyallahu anhum. And so then afterwards, waradu anhu. If Allah is satisfied with you, what else is there for you to be but satisfied with Him? What other satisfaction is there even to seek? All satisfaction will come in His satisfaction with me. ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. That is the supreme achievement. That is the supreme success. That is the greatest thing that we can hope for. Ibn Jusay says, as to the first part of this verse, هذا يوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم عموم في جميع الصادقين. So, in the general sense, all sorts of truthfulness, but he said, وخصوصا في عيسى ابن مريم. But there is also a specific context in the verse because the verses that preceded were talking about Sayyidina Isa, and so there is also a specific aspect. فإن في ذلك إشارة إلى صدقه في الكلام الذي حكاه الله عنه. And so then he said that there is a specific part that relates to him, for in this there is an indication of truthfulness in the words that Allah Ta'ala related to him. Meaning that when Sayyidina Isa said, no, I never told anybody to worship me. That is sidq. And that is something that the Christians will have, that will be a major trial for them on the Day of Judgment when Sayyidina Isa stands before all of creation and rejects their worship of him. Just as the idols on the Day of Judgment, anything that was worshipped by Allah on the Day of Judgment will testify and will reject all those who associated them in partnership with Allah. And that will be in a fitn kabir. وَقَرَغَ غَيْرَ نَافِعٍ. And so he says now, as it gets to this, how to recite the verse in particular, he said, everyone, وَقَرَغَ غَيْرَ نَافِعٍ بَقَيْتِ الْقُرَّاء هذا يوم بالرفع على الابتداء. So all of the other Qur'an, all of the other major scholars of Qira'ah, they recited it as yawmu with a dhamma. And then he says, aw al-khabar. So what he's saying is that it becomes, if you read it that way, the word yawm or day or like Day of Judgment, it becomes a description versus the subject. And we'll get into, okay, how and why does that matter? But then وَقَرَأَ نَافِعْ, Imam Nafi', who was the Qari of Medina. And some of the ulama of Qira'ah have said that the Qira'ah of Imam Nafi' أقرب من قراءة النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام. They have said that it is strong, it is the closest to the Qira'ah of the Prophet ﷺ, of which we know that Imam Nafi' had two students, Warsh and Qalun. Warsh is more popular. Qalun is aqwa. The Qira'ah of Qalun is the stronger of the two. I mean, both are very strong. They're both part of the, they're both mutawatir. They're both Qira'ah mutawatir. They're both beyond questioning of their authenticity. But who is, right, Qalun? That's why the ulama and their tafsir, right, the scholars in their commentaries on the Qur'an, if they're basing their tafsir on a particular qira'ah, and it's the qira'ah of Imam Nafi', then they're going to go with the riwayah of Qalun. So this is why, for instance, Imam al-Shawkani, rahimahullah, his tafsir, Fath al-Qadir, is actually according to the riwayah of Qalun and Nafi'. Likewise, Ibn Juzay. And what's really sad is that actually several of the printings, especially of the publishers that just kind of almost like photocopy these things and put them out. I don't want to say anything against Dar al-Qutb al-Ilmiya, but a publisher like that, they put out the tafsir, so they have like the commentary of the scholar, but the actual Qur'an in the tafsir itself is in the riwayah of Hafs. This is not careful attention to detail in that, like Imam al-Shawkani, Imam Ibn Juzay and others, if they were going to base their tafsir on the qira'ah of Nafi', then it was going to be for Qalun. So when he's saying here about Imam Nafi', that what he says is that is actually nasab, the nasab yawma, he says, وَفِيهِ وَجْهَانِ. So there's two important things that we can see in this. أحدهما أن يكون يوم الظرف لقال. The first is that if you say يوم هذا يوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم, on that day the truthful will benefit from their truthfulness, then the word yom or day becomes a dharf. It becomes a dharf zaman. It becomes an adverb for time, so that it's putting it in the future. فعلى هذا لا تكون الجملة معمول القول. And so he said it becomes an adverb of time in which Allah said, right? So هذا يوم ينفع, that Allah said this. And so in this case, the sentence is not dependent on the verb طال, meaning that the day of judgment is going to happen, and rather it becomes the word هذا becomes actually, it becomes a predicate, right? Do we understand the difference between subject and predicate? Subject is the thing that it's about, and the predicate gives descriptions to it, right? And so it shifts the focus. By going yawma, the focus is on the day and when it's going to occur, versus focusing on other attributes to the day. So by Imam, the reason why Imam Nafi' is reciting it this way is one, there's a sanad, there's a chain of narration that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. But also that grammatically, in terms of ilm al-nahu, also ilm al-ma'ani, in terms of meaning, it also makes sense, because what is Allah talking about in this verse? He's talking about the day of judgment. وهذا خاصة بالمعنى قال الله هذا القصص أو الخبر في يوم. So Allah said this story or this thing will happen on the day, which He said, which is وَحَذَّ بَعِيد. This is unlikely. The focus, the reason why is that what? It's talking about a day that's going to occur, لا ريب فيه, there's no doubt about it. And so it's the main focus of it is that day, and whoever says this or their truthfulness or whatnot, those are all things that are giving description to that day, but the subject is the day in and of itself. He says, وَالْآخِرْ أَنْ يَكُونْ هَذَا مُبْتَدَى. Another interpretation is that the word this or هذا is actually the subject. وَيَوْمَ فِي مَوْضِعْ خَبْرٍ. And that the word day or yom is in the position of the predicate with an implied verb. So this is also like a style in Arabic poetry and balagha and Arabic rhetoric, and in other words, that a lot of times for ease of speaking, eloquence, keeping things somewhat economical, is that you use an implied verb versus an applied verb. So I'll give an example of what I mean by this. So let me pull up my little example sentence here. So for instance, if you take a sentence, جاء الذي تفوق في الامتحان, right? Or you take another verse to say like for instance to say هو عالم عتيق, هو عالم عتيق. He is a very intelligent scholar. I don't have to say هو يكون معلما عتيقا. I don't have to say he is existing or he is being an intelligent scholar. Now the difference is also somewhat between English and in Arabic. In English, we use the word is or to be a lot, which are technically verbs. That's why sometimes in Arabic, you can express something in a verbal or a nominal sentence, or a sentence that has a verb or a sentence that doesn't have a verb. Whereas in English, you're almost always going to have a verb. Like I can't say he's scholar. He's scholar intelligent. That's like, what are you, 1.5? You know, you got a closed head injury. There's something going on here we don't know about. Like you can't say that in English. He good. He's scholar. Like that, you know, he is. Of course, is a verb. But Arabic has this ability to both use verbs and also not to use verbs. And sometimes it's just a matter of keeping things stylistic and to add the verb to it. While it doesn't detract anything grammatically, it does, and this requires an understanding of Arabic on a native level. It just sounds a bit more clumsy. You're just adding too much to it. It becomes burdensome. And so from a stylistic point of view, the Arabs like to do this. This is why in some ways people like to criticize Ammiya. People like to criticize, Arabs in their modern colloquial language. And while it certainly has, obviously it's not the language of the Qur'an, but one of the differences between classical Arabic and modern day Arabic is that Arabs in modern day don't like to use a lot of verbs. They would like to actually convert the verb to like a verbal noun. So like in classical Arabic, if I would say, هل أنت تعرف هذا الشخص؟ لا أنا أعرف هذا الشخص. Do you know that person? No, I don't know. So we would use the verbs عرف. No, I don't know. بس أنت بعرفه? Do you know him? Like they used to like to use ما بعرف, right? They like to try to take the verb and make it into a verbal noun. The reason why is that actually it makes things much more economical. I can say it in that way with kind of more expediency versus saying it in the long form way. I mean, I can say, good morning, Ishaq, or art thou well on this hearkened morning of it? Like, did you mean I'm okay? How am I doing? It's the same thing. And certainly one can be more eloquent, but even in the Qur'an, sometimes Allah Ta'ala makes these stylistic choices to keep the flow of things without bogging down the narrative of the sentence or what is being conveyed by keeping it economic, keeping it, trimmed down. And it's very beautiful. Again, some of this would require a little bit more diligent study to really be able to appreciate that. But that's the essence of why and what is being said. And then the final verse that takes us, لله ملك السماوات والأرض وما فيهن. Most of the verses in the Qur'an that contain this phrase, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. But Allah is going to conclude with a statement of His quwwah and His qudra, of His mulk, of His complete dominion and domination. So everything, لِلَّهِ مُلْك السَّمَوَاتِ. Allah is the possessor, the owner of the heavens. وَالْأَرْض, and of the earth. وَمَا فِيهِنَّ, and absolutely everything and everyone in both of them. وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ, and He has power over all of it. And this is how Allah concludes His beautiful chapter of the Qur'an, the 5th chapter. He ends it by reminding us of His power. And so it's also a way of not only ending the chapter in that way, but He just got to talking about what? هذا اليوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم. On that day, on the day of judgment, those that were truthful about my oneness and about my messenger and on, their iman, their faith in that will benefit them. They will exist forever and ever in gardens and so on and so on. on the day of judgment, what do we say about Allah in Surah Al-Fatiha? Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Mulk, Malik. And of course, in Qira'ah, Nafi', Malik. And al-ma'na wahid, the meaning is one. But Allah is saying, well, and even on the day of judgment, even in the hereafter, I am the possessor, the owner, the controller of everything. And so it's a reminder for us, even when we say in our Fatiha that it is talking about the day of judgment, the consequences, and so on. So this is, mashallah, what we've been able to learn from Ibn Juzay, one of the great scholars of Andalus and one of the great scholars of the Ummah, about this beautiful surah. And we make dua that Allah Ta'ala will bless our Imam, reward him for his effort, for his juhud in tafsir, in his efforts to explain the Qur'an for the benefit of this ummah. May Allah Ta'ala bless him with an enormous reward for doing so. May Allah Ta'ala bless us with the comprehension of it and his beautiful book. And inshallah, may Allah Ta'ala make us amongst those who are the ashab of the Qur'an, those who are amongst the companions of the Qur'an, ala al-yawm al-qiyamah. Inshallah, qulu ameen, ameen. Inshallah. Wa salawatuhu wa salamuhu ala nabiyyihi al-kareem. وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. So inshallah we'll take a little break, and then for those who are going to stick around, we'll come back and we'll finish our class on Maliki fiqh inshallah here in a few minutes. Let me just double check. I forgot actually to check Instagram. I left Instagram hanging. Hopefully y'all didn't have no questions. Good. All right. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.